Reports to the board, 13A. District Legal Counsel, presentation on the California Voting Rights Act and the process for transition to by trustee area elections.
Good evening, Board. Superintendent Hill, staff, members of the public that are still with us. You're pulling up my presentation? Okay, thank you. So I am here to do, later on your agenda, you have an action item for resolution of intent to transition to by trustee area elections. And this presentation will be the first of many you will get over the next few months by me and a district demographer if the board adopts that resolution. And this was a powerful board meeting. I didn't expect this experience. But this conversation tonight about voices and being heard, I think really kind of ties into this conversation we're going to have about the Voting Rights Act and transitioning to by trustee area elections. Because when you talk about voices, vote is your voice. And what this transition is about making sure people's votes matter, that their votes are heard, and that their votes count. So, thank you. So are you going to flip for me, or?
Would you like me to? I could definitely do that.
All right, let's do this as a team. So what we'll talk about first is kind of the election method you're using. What are the options to elect board members for school districts in California? We'll talk about what is the California Voting Rights Act, what's its purpose, intent, and that's what kind of brings us here tonight. And then we'll talk about the process from moving to your current election system to a by trustee area election system. Then I'll note some other considerations, and obviously I'll remain as long as you want to ask questions. But as I'm going through the presentation, if you have questions or want clarification, please ask me. Okay. Next slide. So, like I said, by California statute, there are 3 election methods that can be used to elect board members for school districts. And for decades, the predominant method of election was the at-large election method, which is what the district currently does. The other 2 is what's called a hybrid election system, and we'll talk about what that is. And then there's the district-based or by trustee area election system. So you'll hear it referred to both ways. District-based or by trustee, it means the same thing. Next slide. So what is the California Voting Rights Act? It essentially prohibits the use of an at-large election system that results in racially polarized voting. And racially polarized voting is essentially voting in your jurisdiction that essentially prohibits or precludes race, color, language minorities that are in protected classes from either electing candidates of their choice or to otherwise influence the outcome of elections. And this can be your board elections, it could be ballot measures, anything that gets on the ballot. Next slide. So I think we all know what an at-large election is. You just had that. Congratulations to the new board members and those who were reelected. But essentially that's every voter in your jurisdiction gets to vote for that seat. Right? Next slide. And then you have the by trustee area elections, which is the jurisdiction of the district doesn't change, the boundaries remain the same, but it gets divided up into seats. So you're a 5-member board, so it would be divided into 5 trustee areas. And in that system, you have to be a resident within a particular district, and you only get to vote for candidates in your district, and the candidates also have to live in your district. So in my example here, if you're a resident in election district 5, you can't vote for the candidates that are running in election district 1, right? Simple as it gets. Next slide. Hybrid is a combination of the two. Thus, it's called a hybrid. And in that system, you still have the trustee areas, but you still have at-large voting. So you as the candidate would have to reside within a particular area, but everyone within the district would still vote for you and still have the chance to elect you. So those are the 3 methods. Next slide. And essentially what the California Voting Rights Act does is it creates essentially a preference for and an incentive to transition from at-large to by trustee area. Because it creates essentially, it says you can't be sued for a violation of the California Voting Rights Act if you have a by trustee area election system. And the California Voting Rights Act treats the hybrid system and the at-large system the same for purposes of whether or not there's potentially racially polarized voting and whether or not you can be within a safe harbor. And the reason they're treated the same is in both of those systems, right, you have the at-large voting, which is what the legislature has decided it doesn't want to promote. And what it's created is a plaintiff, who's anyone within a voter within your jurisdiction, can submit a demand letter that says, you use an at-large or hybrid system. We believe that violates the California Voting Rights Act because it creates racially polarized voting. And unless you transition to a by trustee area system, we're going to sue you. Okay? And if you receive a letter like that, you have 2 options. You can either agree to transition within the safe harbor, and there's a particular timeline and process for that we'll talk about in a moment, or you can say we disagree and potentially face the lawsuit. I'll tell you, in probably the decade, 2 decades that this has been going on, no public agency, whether school district, city, special district, has been successful in one of those litigations, and most have settled. The only case where there's been at least a winning decision has been for the city of Santa Monica on appeal, but that's now before the California Supreme Court. And who knows how that's going to come out. All right. So it really has high cost. Many times the fight has been millions of dollars in attorney's fees. I think in the Santa Monica case, the plaintiff's attorney fee demand was about $22 million. So there's some practicality to transitioning. All right. Next slide. All right. So what is the process? Well, you receive a demand letter, which the district's received. You have 45 days from receipt of the demand letter to adopt a resolution of your intention to transition. And that's the resolution you have on your agenda tonight. So you're well within that 45-day requirement period. Next slide. And the process is pretty simple on its face. Once you adopt the resolution of intent, then you hold what are called 2 pre-map hearings. We said we're going to hire a demographer. They're ultimately going to draw some sample maps for you. But before any maps are drawn, you have to have these 2 hearings where I'll present again, the demographer will present and give you a lot of data about the rules for drawing the maps. They'll talk a lot about things like communities of interest and compactness and other parameters on how you draw the maps. And you'll hold a public hearing where you'll get input from your community about what should those maps look like? What are our communities of interest? What do we want to preserve? Where do we want the lines drawn for what reason? You'll have the first one. You'll have another pre-map hearing within 30 days of the first. You'll get more input. And then after that, your demographer will draw the first set of maps. And usually they'll draw 3 to 5. Sometimes it's more. It depends upon the community and district. And then you'll publish those maps. And you'll hold what's called a post-map hearing, the first. And what'll happen there is the community will have had a chance to view those maps. The demographer will likely do another presentation. So you're going to hear a lot from your demographer. And you'll hold another public hearing. And community members will say, we like this map. We hate this map. What about this line? What about this line? Demographer will take all that information in, including information from you, and go back and either retool maps, draw new maps, and those will be published. And we'll hold another public hearing, and we'll take more input, ultimately resulting in a final map that this board will approve. Along with the map, you have to have a sequence of elections in the new trustee areas. So when those maps are presented to you, we'll also work with staff and the demographer to put together some sample sequences of election. And you'll get more data about this because there's many things that go into that, right? This is the first presentation. And then you'll adopt the map, you'll adopt a sequencing schedule, and then all this will be presented to the County Committee on Reorganization, who ultimately has to approve that, right? And so they'll hold a hearing, and representatives of the district will present, members of the public will be able to speak. And once that process is done, you will have successfully transitioned to by trustee area elections. Just like that. Next slide. Okay, so I talked about this. Next slide. So some important basic information is this does not affect the terms of current sitting board members. You will serve out your at-large terms. Where it becomes tricky is what happens, for example, if you're in a district, your term is up in, say, 2024, but you haven't sequenced the election for that district in 2024, right? And so we'll have to talk about those things. Or you could be in the same district, yeah. Yeah, depending upon where people live and how those lines are drawn. And like I said earlier, the external boundaries of the entire district don't change at all. Okay, next slide. So, this is a team approach. It takes a village to move from at-large to by trustee area elections. And so you'll have legal counsel, you'll have a demographer. We'll work with the superintendent and his staff for notices and agendas and all the things that go into this. And as part of this, while the requirements are minimal in terms of the meetings, there's a great push for community outreach. And the county committee is going to expect to see that we've had a robust community outreach. So Many things that districts and boards consider are community input events beyond the required public hearings. You know, getting this out on your social media, multiple languages, maybe partnering and reaching out to different interest groups within the community. And those are things that we can talk about. But we should be intentional about that outreach in your community. Next slide. So, best practices, track our efforts, right? Let's be intentional about that. Plus, we're going to want to package all this to the county committee so that they know we did a great job. We're a model district. Consider all feedback from the community and have multiple streams and mechanisms that they can provide that, whether it's a survey. It shouldn't be just, they need to come to our public hearings or they need to submit a comment card or whatever it is. And creates one place where they can get information. So typically it's on a dedicated page on the website, and we'll post the schedule, we'll post prior presentations, you'll post your maps, obviously, sequence of elections. Oftentimes we'll do a question and answer that's on that website so people can go there and get that information. Next slide. And that's it for tonight. And I'm happy to address any questions.
Not so many questions as a request. One, thank you first of all for the presentation. I would like us to potentially explore in the course of this conversation expanding the number of board members from 5 to 7. There are districts of similar size and population, namely Santa Monica, Malibu, who represents roughly the same in population, and they have 7 council members, 7 in Santa Monica, and 7 trustees for both cities. And I think Burbank's big enough to do that. I think there are benefits to that. It also allows for more localized accountability for board members, so roughly 15,000 people per district, et cetera. So I would like us to consider, what could potentially be prohibit that kind of conversation, whether it needs to be a charter amendment, or whether or not we can do that independently by resolution. I think this would give more voices at the table, which I think is fundamentally what this process is all about, and kind of frankly prepare and build this institution for the long-term future. We've had roughly the same system of government for about 80 years as a school district, and I think a part of our responsibility of trustees is not just to draw lines that secure for 5 more people to take our seats, but frankly, to think about what's good for the future of this community. And I think with increased density, and you name it, in the area, I think 7 makes sense. And it may be time for our council colleagues to consider the same, even if it involves some kicking and screaming. So, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for that suggestion. And speaking of our council colleagues, my understanding is that they will be going through a similar process. Is there any way to collaborate with them? Obviously not on the maps themselves, but at least on the demographer, sharing any of the data around demographics, because I know this is not exactly a cheap endeavor, but I'm very supportive of it.
Yeah, there definitely can be some economies of scale there from the data that the demographer is going to have to use. So if certainly if the city's pursuing that, we can have that conversation.
Okay. And can you just remind me, what do you think is the total time frame of this to get all the way to maps accepted?
Yeah, great question. So once you've adopted the resolution of intent, say tonight, the timeline for the safe harbor requires for our final step to be done within 90 days. I mean, we can't control what the county committee does. There is a process by which, with the agreement of plaintiff, you can extend that by another 90 days for a total of 180 days. But the legislature was very intentional in requiring this to be done quickly?
Just kind of responding to Ms. Ponser-Kempkar, one of the considerations, I think we can work with our city colleagues as best as possible on this front. Because of how district lines, I think one of the major concerns with districts, especially at least from my paradigm, is we've got 2 comprehensive high schools, community day school, Monterey, you name it, and we never want to be in a situation where you have 3 board members because population is concentrated on the hillside, potentially directing funding and making funding decisions that then impact, frankly, the outcomes on the flatlands where, we live, or vice versa, right? And so one, I think expanding the number of seats answers for that by creating smaller districts, which inevitably would, break up and kind of create shared destinies more uniformly. And then the second component that I think is important about it as well is that there may be schools that we want to draw into certain districts, so that way nobody overrepresents elementary schools versus middle schools versus so that's where I just I think it would be lovely if we could draw every line the same. I think also less confusing, or at least try and match pitch or match process a bit, or share costs as we go through this process. I think that's possible, but I will say I think as we're drawing, and I don't see disagreement from you, that we're inclusive of those factors as we draw lines.
Yeah, my proposal is really just that we have the same data that we're starting from,
You
not
bet.
that we have the same lines.
Game on.
Because we have very different interests.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay, great.
Thanks.
Question. When districting, are we required then to represent only the districts only the school sites in our district? Can it continue so that we may be elected by a district, but we still represent all the schools?
Yes, the statute doesn't address this at all. So you're elected to a particular district by the residents of that district. But from a governance standpoint, you're still representing the entire district.
That makes me feel a lot better.
Well, kind of, though. I have to say this, though. So in that scenario, yes, trustees should look out for the interest of everybody in the district. But if you have 1,000, 1,500 people who are motivated, let's say, by a theater program, this is not an unfamiliar example, and that program is potentially cut, but the program across the way at Burbank High, let's say, is on the line as well. Your voters may vote against you in that next election if you don't get that theater program and cut the school across the way. So there are impacts, and so that's why I think, again, creating districts that are smaller potentially, frankly, breaks that influence up a bit. And so that's a part of the motivation for me proposing expanding the number of board seats in total. I have to say, I don't love expanding board seats either. It weakens the board in its checks over the superintendent and administration. I don't love that, clearly. But I do think that, this is a city that's growing, and when we're an eighth the size of Wyoming in population, we need to put this in paradigm and understand. I hate saying it, folks. I got more votes than Pete Buttigieg did for mayor when I ran for school board the first time. That's the reality. So in our population, we need to understand we're bigger than we think. But if you are from this area, you are conditioned to see population differently.
I have lots of questions about this, but so I'm curious, does the statute limit you to kind of having mutually exclusive districts, right? So I know we talked about the hybrid model, right, where all of the trustees have to be from different places, but people elect as a group. But is there a way to do kind of overlapping districts, essentially, where people are voting essentially in every election, but then I've got 2 representatives as a voter rather than only one?
Yeah, as far as I know, we got 3 options.
Okay, fair enough. And that is why I asked.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sure more questions will come up as we go through this process. So thank you. Thank you for your time.
And certainly as you go back, if there are particular questions that you have, and I'm not here for a presentation or whatever, communicate them to the superintendent and we can certainly address those.
Thank you for staying all night with us.
Congratulations.